Hi there, my name's Danny Mulheron and I'm here to introduce my film, The Third Richard. It's a documentary about my grandfather, Richard Fuchs, which I made a few years ago with my wife Sarah. Richard Fuchs was a German Jewish composer who was referred to by his father as the Third Richard. That is, the successor to Richard Wagner and Richard Strauss. Big ambitions. I didn't really take much interest in my grandfather until I ended up with a big carton of compositions, which I took down from my dusty attic and spread out along the floor. And that's really where the story starts. I'd really like to thank the Jewish Music Institute, and I really hope you enjoy it. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to show you the film.
Erlaubnis für eine Aufführung von der Kunstförderung von der Reichskultur kam abgelehnt.
Permission for this concert to proceed has been withdrawn by order of the Ministry of Culture. Inconceivable, really, that someone should care that much about classical music that they should forbid its being played. But that is exactly what happened to Rickard Fuchs. A weird kind of flattery being banned by the Nazis. The year is 1937, and the writing is on the wall for Jewish artists and musicians in Germany. Rickard Fuchs was one of them, a composer, an architect, an artist, a German, a Jew, and a New Zealander. He was also my grandfather. His father called him the Third Rickard. He believed he was the natural successor of Richard Strauss and Richard Wagner, perhaps just the claim of a proud father. Rickard Fuchs loved German culture above all others. Unfortunately, German culture hated him. His music was banned and he was banished. So he fled to the last bus stop in the world. The booming monotone of New Zealand in the 1940s. No longer persecuted, just ignored. A man out of place and out of time. An enemy in Germany because he was Jewish, and an enemy alien in New Zealand because he was German. His compositions destroyed or forgotten. When my grandmother, Dora Fuchs, died, she left me a carton of manuscripts, which I didn't pay much attention to. Until, at the prompting of a music historian, I hauled down this carton from the attic and opened it up. It revealed an enormous array of music. There were symphonies, choral works, all meticulously written out in his architect's hand. Most of this music had never been performed. It had never been heard, not even by the composer. By piecing together all the pictures, the music, the diaries of his wife and daughters, letters from the shattered remains of his family around the world, and my mother Sunny's recollections of her father, a mosaic of Rickard's life and work came together. This is the story of Rickard Fuchs, a lost composer whose inner voice is finally being heard.
That was our backyard. That was the acacia tree in the backyard. My grandparents owned that house for a long time, and we had one apartment in the house, but I remember it was a very big family. Like every Sunday they got together for afternoon tea. All the family came and gathered at Bernhard Fuchs's house. He was the eldest of the 12 brothers. They ran their father's timber business, Fuchs and Söhne, on the banks of the Rhine, shipping logs from the Black Forest to their mill. They were a very affluent family. They had homes, throughout Karlsruhe, particularly in the music district. Bernhard lived in Heidenplatz. Philipp Fuchs, a first cousin, he lived in the Wendstraße. Albert Fuchs, another cousin, in the Bachstraße. And Herbert in the Schubertstraße. Well, music was a great part of their lives. Rickard and his brothers were named after Wagnerian opera heroes. And my grandfather, Gustav, well, even his horse was called Wotan.
The family was fiercely patriotic. Rickard's younger brother Gottfried was a football star, scoring a world record 10 goals for Germany against Russia in the 1912 Olympics. His younger brother Sigmund, a protege of Sigmund Freud, became a famous pioneer in group therapy. Walter was a successful businessman, and Senta, the only daughter, was a talented musician.
Rickard was a very gifted pianist and an artist. He was always painting. When he wasn't painting, he was composing.
He painted prolifically, but music was his first love, and he'd set his heart on being a conductor. He studied at the Karlsruhe Hochschule for music.
But his grandmother, old Fanny, she demanded he have a more practical vocation. So he studied architecture in Berlin. Well, all four of them, the four brothers, they volunteered to fight for Germany in 1914 in the Great War. Rickard was a war artist. He even got an Iron Cross.
Another Wagner-loving soldier fighting for Germany in his early 20s also had dreams of being an architect and painted delicate watercolours on the front line. Adolf Hitler. In those days, they were both on the same side.
Well, after the war, he married Dora Stern. He'd first met her at a family gathering. She was quite young then, and he told her that when she was older, he'd marry her. And that's exactly what he did. Life for the Fuchs family in the late 20s was pretty good. Rickard's architecture business was doing pretty well, and his buildings were, they were in all the papers, they were published.
Rickard designed department stores, museums, hotels, apartment buildings, factories, residences, as well as this distinctly styled synagogue in Gernsbach.
Rickard and Dora and Eva and I, and the nanny and the cook, lived in a large house at Kriegstraße 120. And the house included separate apartments for my grandparents and for the chauffeur.
Rickard was getting his music performed by local chamber groups, and this was being well received in the papers. Karlsruhe Tagblatt, 23rd February 1932. Dr. Rickard Fuchs is not only an architect of standing, but showed himself as a composer of noteworthy degree. In the same newspaper, on the same page, Rickard's compatriot was standing for president. For a brief moment, Rickard stood at the edge of fame. But this concert was the last time his music would be enjoyed by a non-segregated German audience for 75 years. In 2007, out of the blue, my mother received a letter from Karlsruhe. A concert entirely devoted to the works of Rickard Fuchs was going to take place in his hometown of Karlsruhe. It would be the first time I would hear his music, the first time my mother would hear it, and the first time members of the Fuchs family had been welcomed back to the city that destroyed them. We didn't expect any fanfare, but when we arrived in Karlsruhe, we were greeted by a large article in the paper. In the background of this photo is a famous city landmark. It was in this tower the Lord Mayor gave Sonny an official welcome.
Das vor den Bergen noch sehen, mit so wie so rosa und pink, das da hinten. Das ist das Gebäude, wo die das vor dem... Und trotzdem, Frau Malherren, ist dieser Besuch etwas ganz Besonderes.
This visit is something quite special, because on the 19th, it will be the first time there will be a public performance of your father's works, who was not only a good architect, an outstanding architect, as well as a gifted musician. And on the 19th, there will be, for the first time, thanks to the Musikhochschule, there will be the first concert of your father's works. That was a week away, but I wasn't going to wait that long. I wanted to meet the musicians. Here in the Schloss Gottesau, the oldest building in Karlsruhe, now home to the Karlsruhe Hochschule for Music, Moscow-born Anna Zasamova was playing the piano in Rickard's quintet. I think the thing to remember when because he was so romantic about German, especially the Black Forest and the nature, and it was that sort of comes through in the music a lot, how much he loved Germany at the time. And what's interesting about his life is how Germany betrayed him. But not at this stage. 31, he was happy, had a kid, he was wealthy. They lived all in Heidenplatz, all the music area, his brothers and cousins, hundreds. And this is very happy times. And I don't know if there's there's no hint of anything to come in this music, is there? One thing that could be said about Rickard Fuchs is he had a lot of confidence in his music. He didn't just send his compositions to local conductors, he sent them to the greatest maestros of the time, Wilhelm Furtwängler and Felix Weingartner, the principal conductors of the Berlin and Vienna Philharmonics. Weingartner especially praised his accomplishment as a composer. I have your score and looked through it. I'm really astounded that you, not a professional musician, are so skilled technically. Your work deserves recognition, but this is not the time for it. He was right. 1930s Germany was not a great time or place for scheduling the premiere of a new work by an unknown Jewish composer.
Mach das Staccato da. Sie steht eigentlich Legato, bei euch auch?
Das sind bis 95.
Rickard may have been a good pianist, but he didn't have much empathy for other instrumentalists. Across town, in another part of the music school, students are struggling with the wind octet.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
This is the same building where Rickard studied composition nearly 100 years earlier.
For me, it's sometimes like a mix between Strauss and Schönberg, because I think we might have some problems to get all the sounds in balance. Yeah. So we can put it together on the one hand, and on the other hand we can just have a flow into the music and just let it go.
And this piece, do you think there's much to interpret?
There is, of course, but we are now at the beginning. We're just learning to know it, that everybody knows how the piece sounds, where is the melody, where the main theme is, what he's doing, and we have some rehearsals.
This piece was called Joyful Music for 8 Wind Instruments and was composed in 1933, the year the Nazis came to power.
Life changed pretty quickly after that. I have to get up here. Oh, thanks. I was put on the tram. I had been playing with Walter in the Riefstahlstraße, and his nanny put me on the tram and said to the tram driver and to the conductor, "Can you keep an eye on this little girl? She has to get off at Ettlinger Tor." Oh, okay. And so we drove off, and I must have been a cute little girl, you know, all little kids are cute. I remember wearing a hat with a pom-pom, and it must have been winter. I had a little fur coat on. People started talking to me. They said, "Oh, and what's your name?" I said, "Sonny Fuchs." "And where do you live?" And I said, "Rickstraße 120, because they taught me that. "Oh. And da wohnst du?" They said, "Is that where you live?" I said, "Yeah." And then they said, "And does your papa say Heil Hitler nicely? Does he say Heil Hitler nicely? Can you say Heil Hitler nicely?" I said, No, my daddy doesn't say Heil Hitler." And then, I can't remember much. I used to look out the window. They said I had to get off 7 stops later. And the tram driver and the conductor, they looked after me. But when we stopped at the Ettlinger Tor, I knew I had to get off there. Maria was our maid, had been told to come out and get me so we could walk back to the Kriegstraße, 120. And it was about 5 minutes walk, not far, but I couldn't go alone at night. So I noticed that the tram conductor and the tram driver and Maria were having a conversation. I didn't really know what they were talking about, but I just knew they were saying something. Just had a feeling. I mean, look, I was 6 years old. I didn't understand what the hell was going on. And Maria and I walked home, and by the time we got home, which was about 5 to 10 minutes walk, the Gestapo were there in my father's apartment interviewing him. And that was really the first time that I thought, gee, there's something funny, and I said something I shouldn't have said. I don't know what, because I was only 6, but it was the first time I actually became aware You've got to be careful in this place. You can't just talk because there are consequences. And it was very frightening for me, but it was more frightening for my father. But isn't it scary? How did that happen? And here are this, I just want to look out the window for a bit now.
Ich hatte einst ein schönes Vaterland, der Eichenbaum wuchs dort so hoch, die
He had also symphonies.
Yeah, symphonies, operas. He must have had a lot of piano music because we can't find it. But, he had the octet, a lot of lieder. Then he had to write Jewish music, which was, what is Jewish music? They were German or the Polish or Hungarian, so they didn't know what that was. But they were only allowed to play for Jewish audiences. Hans Hinkel, the comically named Reich Culture Governor, said, "Jewish artists are working for Jews. They may work unhindered so long as they restrict themselves to the cultivation of Jewish artistic and cultural life." And if that wasn't bad enough, Rickard was strictly forbidden to practice architecture. He described his work situation in a letter. "I doubt if you can really imagine our situation. Every Jewish architect gets a letter that is a non-Aryan. He is not fit to administer German goods of civilization and therefore cannot be a member because unfit persons must be excluded. And so he has to give up his profession. Isn't it very simple?" This stopped a promising career at a time when he was beginning to develop a distinctive and individual style. Today his buildings have a heritage protection status. One of the few residences left was designed by Rickard for the chief chimney sweep of Karlsruhe. An inlaid wood panel depicting the patron saint of chimney sweep, St. Florian, was among other playful features. Why did you like them?
I don't like snakes.
So Frau Rotter, come.
Yeah.
And Rosemary, this is amazing.
It is.
I love this.
Dieser Übergang, der von der Schlange da hinten.
Gerhild Rotter, an architect and researcher, described it as modern expressionism.
Expressionismus.
Yeah, very expressionistic.
Yeah.
Very.
Also diese Form.
There are interesting contrasts between expressionist features and modernist detailing. And you don't like this?
Und
I love that.
They say architecture is frozen music. Rickard's use of traditional and modernist themes, as well as expressionist ornamentation, are just as true of his compositions. The house was officially opened by the local Nazi Gauleiter and other high-ranking party officials. Rickard wryly described the scene to Dora. They made big speeches and kept saying in a friendly and sincere way how very different, how much more beautiful, and what works of art new German buildings like this were in the new German Reich, which pleased me, as you can imagine. Had they known the architect was Jewish, the speeches might have been very different. It was the last house in Karlsruhe Rickard was permitted to design. Just as my grandfather was stopped from designing buildings, my mother was stopped from entering them.
This is the Gartenschule. That's the first school I went to when I lived in the Kriegsstraße. I didn't have terribly good memories of the Gartenschule because by the time I came to school in 1934, the Nazis kept a very close eye on my favourite teacher, Herr Dewald. And every week they had to write a slogan on the blackboard, and the kids had to say that slogan. Stuff like, "The Jews are no good, beware of the Jews, hütet euch vor den Juden, die Juden sind Untermenschen, the Jews are not even human." And the incident I remember is when I had to be, I don't think Mr. Dewald wanted to do this, but they were watching him. I was stood up in front of the class and the kids said, "Hütet euch vor den Juden, die Juden sind Untermenschen. Be careful about the Jews are subhumans." And I got so scared, I wet myself. In fact, I did more than wet myself, I shit myself. And I was terribly humiliated. And I ran out the door and ran home. And Mr. Dewald, he either rang my parents or he came to see my parents and said, "Don't send your little girl to the school anymore. I can't do anything about it. They're watching me. Do not send her to school." And a little while after that, they started a Jewish school, and all the Jewish kids and all the retarded children who were equally undesirable for the Nazis, people that were not fully functional, were not wanted.
Rickard's music changed. It had to. Jewish themes dominated. Once Rickard realised what the Germans were doing to the Jews, he worked tirelessly for Jewish culture in Karlsruhe. He established the local branch of the Jüdischer Kulturbund, set up to provide work for Jewish artists, for a strictly Jewish audience. His own music was performed at these concerts, including some of his songs, sung by the great Russian bass, Alexander Kipnis.
But I do remember that he did not want to be paid in money, because my parents kept on talking about it afterwards, how crazy it wasn't though. He wanted diamonds because he wanted to take the diamonds out to Switzerland, because he knew where he was going.
In 1937, Rickard turned 50. Why he stayed so long, no one knows. Perhaps he thought the nightmare would end, or perhaps as the eldest son, he wanted to protect his ageing mother. Rickard wrote his most important and heartfelt work, Vom jüdischen Schicksal, The Jewish Fate, a massive choral piece based on the poems of the great Karl Wolfskehl. He entered it in a prestigious national music competition, and on the 10th of May 1937, he received the news. He had won first prize. The judges described the work as a heroic composition of verve and strength, sometimes even monumental. There was no doubt it would be performed. But then, without warning, after the scores had been prepared and rehearsals begun, Rickard was informed that Hans Hinkel had forbidden the concert to be held, and that Vom jüdischen Schicksal was not even allowed to be played privately. This was the end for Rickard's career in Germany. That summer was the last holiday they would have in Germany. They spent it with friends at Lake Constance. Dora Fuchs wrote a diary of their last months in the fatherland.
Really, that summer of 38 was more of a farewell to so many of our friends who left before we did. We had 8 beautiful sunny days at the wonderful lake. That was our last trouble-free holiday. The 6 of us sat by the lake. We knew it would be the last time we were together. We had a lot of fun in spite of the sign, Jews not welcome. I did have a lump in my throat. Rickard did a painting of fishing boats on the lake, and as we stood on the terrace of the hotel and looked across the countryside and the vineyards all gleaming in the sunset, and everything was so peaceful as though there were no Hitler or anything.
Rickard's 16-year-old daughter Eva kept a journal as well, and though ever present, Hitler was overshadowed by more important concerns, like crushes on boys.
I went swimming with him, Eric, and some others in Maxau, and we swam across the Rhine and I got my sports badge. By the way, I loved the nice new pool, where according to Article 8, Jews were not wanted. But as we were the only guests, xenophobia was not possible. It was great. I went home with Eric on his motorbike and it was terribly cold. It might have been very romantic. Full moon, snow, fog, but hopeful as I was. That's all. Full moon, snow, fog.
Summer was coming to an end, and the fog of war was descending on Germany.
In the September of 1938, the world thought there would be a war. We kept our nerve till the 27th, and on the 28th, we quickly sent a registered letter airmail to New Zealand. This letter was important for our subsequent fate, a request to emigrate to New Zealand.
It was an exciting time. Hitler had taken over the Sudetenland. Suspicion hung over everything. Everything was a bursting point in Karlsruhe. They were preparing for war like crazy. People began to flee.
New Zealand was as far from Europe as it was possible to be. By 1938, Karlsruhe was practically empty of Jews. All those who could afford to had left. Where once 80 Fuchses might have lunched together, now there were only a handful. Today there is only one place in Karlsruhe that you will find the remnants of the Fuchs family. A large monument dedicated to the victims of the Nazis stands guarding the entrance. A massive list of names, a giant page of the permanently deleted from the Karlsruhe telephone book. A lot of people think of the Holocaust now as a movie genre. It is sobering rolling my eyes down these etched credits on their stone screen. Beneath some bushes I found Rickard's first cousin, Philip Fuchs. The date of his death will give you some idea of how he died. The 10th of November, 1938. The night of November the 9th, 1938 was the German version of 9/11. Only this time, the terrorists were the state. Late on the night of the 9th, the radio broadcast the decree of SS Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler that unless all Jews turned in their firearms, they would be placed in protective custody for a minimum of 20 years. Protective custody for a Jew very often meant a fate worse than death. What followed on that night, the Nazis, the ultimate romantics, called Kristallnacht, after the long shards of glass which lay on the streets. And though called Kristallnacht, most atrocities were saved for the next morning, at a more civilized hour. My grandmother, matter of fact as always, kept a journal of this time.
At 7:30 in the morning, Mrs. Oppenheimer came tearing upstairs. It was just when Sonny was off to school. The 2 synagogues are in flames. Everything has been bashed up. I took a taxi to Kate's to tell her. All the windows of all the Jewish shops have been smashed in. It is morning at 7:45. People are standing in the streets. They are shaking their heads. The synagogue has been burnt to the ground. I find out from the fireman that the children had not been in the schoolroom. I heard from the fireman that all synagogues were to be burnt down early this morning.
Rickard's synagogue in Gernsbach was one of them. Gernsbach is a very old and picturesque town in the Black Forest, with its own Judengasse, a shocking pun in English, but merely a name for the Jewish quarter. The synagogue was burnt to a cinder under the careful eye of the fire department, who ensured innocent buildings next door didn't get damaged. All that remains now is a bronze memorial built into a suburban fence. It was never rebuilt. There was no need. The parishioners had either left or been burnt as well. That morning, concerned about his relatives, Rickard visited their Aunt Henrietta. At the same time, the SS was systematically doing the rounds of all Jewish households, arresting the men, and if the father wasn't present, taking the sons. Dora continued.
Rickard has been dragged off by a group of thugs. Then Kate told me that the SS people had taken Bobby with them, a little boy of 9. Rickard had been arrested at Tante Hennes. Except for a very few men, they locked up the lot of them. At 8:30 Anna rang and said Philip has killed himself.
Philip Fuchs was Rickard's first cousin. Another cousin, Albrecht Fuchs, described arriving at the scene.
I was shown the fully clothed corpse of my cousin lying in a pool of blood in his bedroom and was told the following. A flying squad of 4 thugs with cocked revolvers in brown shirts and civilian jackets demanded to enter his apartment while 4 others stood watch in front of the house. Philip Fuchs realized what was happening through the sliding glass door. He announced to the men that he would not let them in. He put the chain on the door, locked himself into his bedroom with his wife and picked up his pistol. The maid had also fled into her room. In reply to their shouts that they would now shoot him, Philip answered that would not be necessary as he could do it himself. He put the pistol to his temple and shot himself in the head as he stood next to the bed. Then the maid came back from interrogation. She sobbed aloud because she was horrified by what she had seen. She told us that Jews who had been arrested were being driven from all over the place to the district office. Sometimes there were many in one truck, other times there was one by himself in a cart. They were jeered at and mistreated. She said that in front of the district office there was an inhuman crowd that beat the arriving detainees half to death before they were thrown into the prison courtyard.
Be glad, Frau Fuchs, that your husband shot himself. At least you know how he died.
Dora, however, had no idea if Rickard was alive or dead.
No, I was just suddenly overwhelmed by the Fuchses who was really sad and quiet. They've been so good to us too, haven't they?
Rickard had been transported to Dachau, the grandfather of all concentration camps. It is situated in a little town near Munich, not in some distant forest, but just a short tram trip from the local railway station, as close and familiar as a suburban sports field, only bigger, much, much bigger. You couldn't really ignore it, but in those times not knowing about it was not only an excuse, it was an order.
Ich hatte einst ein schönes Vaterland, der Eichenbaum wuchs dort so hoch, die Veilchen.
Rickard composed this song, De Fremde, 1 year earlier. It is about home being in a foreign land.
Es war ein Traum. Es war ein Traum. Das küsste mich auf Deutsch und sprach auf Deutsch. Man glaubt es kaum, wie gut es klang, das Wort, ich liebe dich. Es war ein Traum. Es war ein Traum.
Rickard was permitted to send a postcard from Dachau to his family. 15th of November, 1938. I am well. You could send me some money, but I don't need any. And I don't need anything else either. Eva, heartfelt wishes for your birthday. And Sonia, a kiss for you too. And of course one for you, dear Dora. I hope you are all well. Oma as well. Yours, Rickard.
On the 11th of November, poor Eva arrived home from Hamburg. Then a cable arrived from Wellington. Our request had been granted.
Now that immigration was assured, Dora visited SS officer Herr Seidel at Gestapo headquarters. They formed a strange alliance.
On November 15th, I managed to get an interview with the Gestapo, and Seidel told me Rickard would probably be home in about a week. I got everything ready for our immigration. I went to the tax office for written authority of our passports and had to pay 50 marks to the gas company and God knows what other stuff. I went to the border authorities. Then suddenly one of the officials asked me very nicely, "Well, are you Mrs. Fuchs? Because just now Mr. Seidel from the Gestapo rang and inquired about you." He rang him for me. I was to go there immediately. Herr Seidel told me, "Your husband will be out in a couple of days. You are Jewess. May I shake your hand?" "Yes, of course."
Although I tried to find out what happened to Herr Seidel, he remains an elusive figure. Seidel was always extremely courteous and respectful, even when executing what he must have known were terrible injustices. Was this good luck and farewell for her benefit, or for his? But I think the truth was he knew her and liked her, and for a moment they became friends. God knows what became of the people Herr Seidel didn't like.
For days I had been putting a hot water bottle in his bed because I kept thinking he would be home today.
Eva's best friend Gustl was at the Fuchs house when he came home.
I think she mentioned
She remembered Dora's reaction.
Suddenly there was a ring of the bell in the house, and she was upstairs and went down very quickly, and she very nearly fell. And then I heard her cry, Richard,
Rickard, bist du?
Ja, Rickard, bist du?
At 5:30 in the morning, the hall door opened. I jumped out of bed and there was Rickard. His head was shaved and he was laughing, there in our sitting room.
He said, I'm so happy you are all here and you are all alive, and something like that. And I only noticed that he was completely shorn.
He was in quite a good mood and looked quite well. But later, oh dear, and about Dachau itself, I'd rather not say anything. Those bastards.
Dora, ask me nothing. I remember everything very well, and one day I will tell you about it. But one thing I will tell you. It was a race with death. When Rickard's hair did grow back, it was mostly white.
Rickard sold our house to the city. We had to pay 45,000 marks for taxes for being allowed to leave the Reich, for being Jewish, etc., etc., so that we could finally have all the papers we needed to be allowed to emigrate. Rickard had to pay 150,000 marks taxes for our poor mother. We dealt with everything. We destroyed thousands of drawings, thousands of books and furniture we gave away.
And then suddenly Father could not stand it anymore. We left the apartment B and gave Steffelin permission to pack without us. We had a big dinner at Tante Henne's and off we went.
Steffelin are a local furniture removal firm. They took care of everything and packed it all into 2 massive wooden containers. I visited them while I was in Germany to thank Herr Paul Komarek, chairman of the board of directors. When I was 18, my grandmother died and I went into the back shed of her house. It was full of furniture and paintings and boxes and cutlery, everything you would need in a new country, as well as my grandfather's artwork, his music, an immense amount of stuff. And it was all wrapped up in a Nazi newspaper, Der Stürmer. And I unpacked it, this treasure. Steffelin had delivered this. In June 1939, these gigantic containers couldn't get through the Karori tunnel where they lived. So it must have been big containers, yeah? They arrived early in March 1939, settled into a house, and then in June they got word that their furniture had arrived. And Steffelin, much to their credit, had delivered it when they could have taken it. A lot of other Jewish property, which was being also shipped around the world, was never seen again. But Steffelin's basically did their job and treated Jewish people just like any other citizen, right up to the end when they didn't need to. Right after Kristallnacht, they treated my grandmother with respect. And all I wanted to say to you was thank you so much for that. So thank you, Herr Komarek. Okay. Thank you. I really thank you for that. Oh, that's beautiful. Look at that. Brilliant. And you rode this horse?
Lola.
Lola! Fantastic. The moment had come to leave, but before they did, Eva had her own version of Kristallnacht.
As a farewell gesture, I had been so furious that I took a chair and smashed one of the windows at her place. You have to do something.
There was still family left in Karlsruhe whom they had to say goodbye to. But by far the hardest farewell for Rickard was leaving his mother. whom he'd protected from the Nazis for so long. They both must have known it would be the last time they would see each other.
And then on the 16th of December we left, saying goodbye to our dear 75-year-old mother. And then slowly the train left the station. We were away forever. No one can possibly understand what this is like, not unless you have experienced it yourself. Everything whizzed past, and then we were at the Dutch border. All four of us were tearful. The German customs officer must have noticed how heavy-hearted we were, because he was very decent.
At the border, everything went without a hitch. Too easy, if you think about it.
Rickard's life was now contained in a single briefcase, which he carried with him over the border. He had left his homeland forever. "70 years later, the Fuchses are arriving back in Karlsruhe for the concert. While I was in the botanical gardens, I was recognised by a friend of the Fuchs family from an article in the newspaper, Andreas Hirsch. His grandfather Julius Hirsch and my great-uncle Gottfried had been the two great soccer legends, the last Jews ever to play for Germany. While Gottfried Fuchs had escaped to Canada, Julius Hirsch was murdered in Auschwitz. In 1972 they asked Gottfried back.
Yeah.
And what happened there?
Gottfried Fuchs was very critical about any award, any honor from Germany. He said, no, I will not go to Germany because they have killed Julius Hirsch. And he was not able to make this step.
There's a word they've used called rehabilitation. Rickard Fuchs concert, rehabilitation. And I wondered if that meant something different in German than English, because you rehabilitate criminals.
Yeah.
And Rickard was not a criminal. It should be the Karlsruhe is rehabilitated. That's the big point.
Yeah.
Who is rehabilitating who?
Yeah.
Who is forgiving who?
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can forgive Karlsruhe yet, or ever. I don't know about Mum. But this concert I love because I want to hear the music. I love the kids who are playing.
Yes.
I love the friends we've made here, like yourself, and people have been wonderfully generous. But forgiveness has to be hard and has to be earned.
Yeah, has to be earned. That's right.
Forgiving may be hard, but flirting is a lot easier. Sonny had avoided meeting Germans of her own age. She wouldn't know what side they'd been on. But Herr Josef Werner, an historian, wanted to meet her, and made no attempt to hide his past as a soldier for the Third Reich, or his Nazi sympathies as a young man. It was like a Sound of Music reunion. They got on famously. In the years before the war, I was in a national organisation called the Steel Helmet. This organisation grew out of the history of the First World War. We went on many trips and excursions, and as a young man I loved it. How old were you?
17, 18.
I was 17, 18. And we all thought that National Socialism was a kind of national spring.
Und Hitler hat es verstanden,
And Hitler understood that.
Innerhalb relativ kurzer Zeit, in
And
2
within 2
Jahren,
years,
war die Arbeitslosigkeit fast halbiert.
unemployment was halved.
Ich möchte noch was wissen.
But I'd like to know something.
Sie waren doch da, wo waren Sie
Where
denn
were
zum
you
Beispiel an dieser schrecklichen Kristallnacht?
during the terrible Kristallnacht?
Das kann ich Ihnen auch sagen. Da war
I
ich
can tell you
Soldat,
this.
Und zwar beim Reichskriegsgericht
I was a soldier
Berlin.
in the War Ministry
Und
in
da hörte
Berlin,
ich nachts Schreie.
and I heard screams in the night,
Schreie, die man nicht definieren konnte, woher
and I
das
couldn't
kommt.
tell where it came
Wir
from.
erfuhren auch zunächst nichts, was da los ist.
We didn't
Und
know
dann
what was going
hörte
on.
ich, dass in Berlin, im Zentrum von
And
Berlin,
then I heard in central
diese
Berlin
schrecklichen Zerstörungen
there was
der
terrible destruction.
Geschäfte sich
The
vollzogen
shops
und dass die Synagoge brannte.
and the synagogue
Bin
was burning.
nach dem Kurfürstendamm,
So I went to
das ist
Kurfürstendamm
Alexanderplatz.
near Alexanderplatz,
Damals war noch jedes dritte,
where
vierte
every
Geschäft
third or fourth
jüdisch,
shop
jüdisch.
was Jewish,
Und die Banken?
and the
Und
bank,
deren Banken
and the bank,
und deren Schaufenster waren alle eingeschlagen.
and all their windows
Alle
were smashed.
eingeschlagen, die Sachen zerstört zum Teil.
Was haben Sie sich dabei gedacht?
Und dann,
And what did you
ich
think
dachte
about
dabei, das ist unmöglich. Das
I thought
ist
it was impossible.
unerhört, ein
It was
Unrecht
unheard of.
sondersgleichen.
It was a crime.
Also ich empfand das zum ersten Mal, muss ich sagen,
It was
habe
the first
ich
time
innerlich Abstand genommen
I distanced
vom
myself
Nationalsozialismus.
from National Socialism.
Innerlich, als ich das sah.
Ja. Ich danke Ihnen wirklich, dass Sie so
I'm really
offen
grateful
gesprochen haben.
Ja.
for you speaking to me so honestly.
Bitte.
Das ist mir auch ein Gut. Dankeschön. Also.
Ja.
After a stormy crossing, the Fuchses arrived in England. They caught a train from London to Dorking straight away, where they'd been offered sanctuary by a Quaker family, the Harveys.
I collapsed into Mrs. Harvey's arms, sobbing. All of them were very moved, Rickard and Eva as well. The Harveys were sensitive and kind and helped us through these most difficult weeks of our lives. In Dorking, we met really kind people. Everybody invited us. At one of these parties, Laurence Olivier, who lived in Surrey at the time, entertained everybody. He had just been in a film Fire Over England. Rickard went up to him and said, "Young man, you are really very good. You should be an actor." Mr. Ralph Vaughan Williams, an eminent composer, invited us for tea several times and took us here and there in his car. They collected money from some of his friends and then gave us £100. How is it that strangers can be so generous?
That's from Vaughan Williams.
Oh yes, that was a great letter. And in my opinion, he's a well-trained composer with an excellent technique in all the branches of composition of which he has shown me examples. Ralph Vaughan Williams.
Finally, travel confirmation arrived and the boat set sail for New Zealand on the 17th of February 1939.
"20th of February. The passengers are nice on the whole. Nice Dutch guy, 3rd class. 20-year-old smartasses from Berlin. Charming Japanese lady with her husband, and to top it all, a really disgusting Jewish family. The father and son are nuts, really. The mother is so stupid and dumb that she'd burst if she wasn't wearing so many corsets. The weather continues to be fine. Up at 5:38 a.m. Gibraltar. My God, these Englishmen are some guys. This entrance to the Mediterranean is an amazing fortification, an amazing defense. No one is going to get through here, Mr. Hitler. Saturday, February 25th. Rather stormy. At noon we pass Corsica and later Sardinia. Is it not strange when hearing a name, Corsica? The first thing we think of is Napoleon. Is Hitler like Napoleon? Perhaps, but he does not love women. That makes him worse. Movies at night, but I am lying in bed. The Gulf of Naples. Mount Vesuvius smoking before us. Because of the J in our passports, we are not allowed offshore. Mean buggers. Wednesday, the 1st of March, 39. Towards 5 in the evening, we finally reached Suez. Father quickly did a painting, and on we sailed.
The family arrived in New Zealand on the Awatea in March 1939.
It was a wonderful, bright, crisp day, and the Tararua had snow on them, and coming into the harbour was absolute magic. And I don't know how he felt. I just felt terribly excited to be able to get off the boat.
And so they come to New Zealand. After years in the wilderness, the moment they've been longing for has arrived. But now that they're about to set foot in the promised land, there are misgivings. How different will it be? How will they be received? It won't be easy to adapt themselves to a new way of life, but people who have been through so much don't expect things to be easy. Their first impressions are good. Friendly officials of the immigration department direct them to the train with a minimum of fuss.
I think he was just so glad to be as far away from Europe as he could possibly get that it wouldn't have made much difference. But as far as the buildings were concerned, he was, well, a bit taken aback, because at that time Wellington didn't have any high-rise buildings in it. It didn't look like a European city. It was just sort of little wooden houses scattered across the hillside, and when you went to town, there was nothing. There were no coffee houses or restaurants or anything, and, you know, nothing that he'd been used to in Europe, sitting around in coffee shops talking, or in restaurants smoking, and he always smoked a cigar. For instance, on a Sunday in Karlsruhe, people used to get dressed up and wear their best clothes, and they'd promenade up and down, you know, go to the Botanische Garten or somewhere. And in New Zealand, people put on their grubbiest clothes and got up on the roof and painted it, or they grew carrots and cabbages, and they thought he was odd because he never did that.
These are the photos he had in New Zealand. He had a nice suit on, didn't he?
He was always wearing suits. He occasionally condescended to wear an open-neck shirt. Very elegant guy.
There's Firth Terrace. That's the house he used to live in Karori.
And actually, he did have a garden in that house. Well, the first thing my father did was dig up the front garden and plant potatoes. And then the neighbours were very offended by that, because you just didn't do that. You had to have a front lawn that was nice and tidy, and he didn't cut the grass. And the next door neighbours said, "Why don't you cut the grass? You're supposed to cut them." He liked the daisies and the buttercups and the dandelions. He liked it. He just left it.
Rickard found work as an architect for Natush & Sons and then with the Ministry of Works, who was a benign employer of European refugees.
Oh, I do remember then when the orchestra first started, I think my father must have gone and he was appalled because people went along in fur coats with their knitting. They didn't do that. This simply was not done in Europe. You went along.
In New Zealand, there is still the sanity of people having tea and cakes, with children playing round them, eyes unspoiled by sight of horrors, ears not yet deafened by the sound of bombs.
It wasn't Germany, and that made it all the better. But within 6 months of their arrival in the country, war was declared, and Rickard Fuchs was deemed a threat to national security and proclaimed an enemy alien. He had curfews put on his travel and had to report to the police every week. It also had drastic effects on his employment. It is with regret that I've had to tell Mr. Fuchs that on account of the war affecting this office, I cannot keep him on the staff. My regret is greater as I realise that as a refugee from an enemy country, he will have trouble in finding employment. Rickard's situation became desperate. He wrote to the Public Service Commissioner. Since months and months of seeking, I find myself unable to find any new position whatsoever. I would of course be prepared to take any job, for I am literally facing now starvation with my family. There is only one hope left to us, and this is to become true citizens of New Zealand as soon as possible. This was sooner said than done, though. Rickard was not even permitted to help the war effort.
So my father wanted to join the Home Guard. Now, remember, this is at the same time as his brother Michael in England, you know, Sigmund Heinz Michael. He was a major in the British Army, but they wouldn't let my father into the Home Guard because he was a bloody foreigner. He was an enemy alien.
At least it was reassuring for him to know that New Zealanders hated the Germans as much as he did. It was like the old joke. A German Jew mistaken for a Nazi is assaulted by his Allied captors. He keeps laughing through the beating. "Why are you laughing so much?" And the Jew replies, "I love seeing Germans getting beaten up." Unemployed again, Rickard was left a lot of time to compose, and did so prolifically. He offered his services to the Chamber Music Society and was an active member, but made the cardinal sin of suggesting that they perform some of his own compositions. I would be delighted to have the opportunity to show you some unmistakable proof of my artistic value, visible and audible. He may have well as signed his own artistic death sentence. Blowing your own trumpet is the worst sin to a New Zealander, even if you are a musician. Please do help me now to become known to a greater circle in this country. I trust you will not think of me as being conceited about my importance if I say myself that my work deserves to be known.
I think my father was very lonely because there was nothing much doing in the Wellington musical scene, and he didn't know anybody.
What about that cop? Didn't he listen?
It was during the war, and we were enemy aliens, and we had to have blackout. Everybody had to have blackout curtains. And the local cop used to walk around and look to see whether we had blackout curtains. Actually, he was quite a nice guy. He probably had Parkinson's, but we kids called him Swivelhead, poor guy. Anyway, Swivelhead used to come round. My father was always playing the piano at night. Just played the piano, played and played and played. And this guy used to stand outside and listen.
He tried writing New Zealand music, patriotic songs, military band music, also a New Zealand Christmas carol based on a poem by Eileen Duggan, which got played after he died for the Queen's visit, 1953. Once the war ended, Rickard became a New Zealand citizen. It was his proudest moment, but doors still remained steadfastly shut. I am still unable to regard this as home, and New Zealanders are very parochial, not to say pig-headed, and not easily moved to accept a foreigner as one of their own. New Zealand is a miniature world of its own. It is Lilliput. He was talking about the geography, the diverse and compact landscape which he adored, but subconsciously he must have identified with Gulliver. He was now a New Zealander, writing New Zealand music. He was New Zealand's Bruckner, its Strauss perhaps, maybe even its Wagner. He wrote music ideally suited to the landscape and dramatic isolation of New Zealand. Having no luck locally, he sent his manuscripts all over the world, hoping they might be performed. But he was met with silence or polite indifference. I'm between people who are either 100 years back in musical taste or are snobs of the most modern atonal, I had attempted to write atonal music, craziness. His daughter Eva was the more realistic. They want a New Zealand composer, not a Jew from Germany. My father wore his heart and boots out going to local musicians, only to be put off. And news began to filter through about what had happened to his sister, Senta. During the night before your letter arrived, I had a dream. My sister's head appeared like Banquo's ghost in Macbeth, and I was very moved and asked her why she was so tearful and distraught. But she just shook her head silently. Those poor souls. She and her husband were transported to a gas camp. The last thing anyone knows is that my brother-in-law said he had some poison and that he would not let his wife suffer. Hopefully those bastards let him have the poison. The least they could do. Perhaps stricken by the news from Europe and the lack of interest in his music, Rickard stopped composing for the last 20 months of his life. He must have been frustrated and disappointed. All people need to be heard, especially composers. He died quite suddenly, didn't he? And that wasn't expected, obviously.
He died not suddenly, but quickly. He had pancreatitis, and he was in hospital for about a week.
A year earlier, he had unknowingly written his own obituary in a speech he gave about his beloved composer, Mahler. It is said Mahler died of homesickness, and I am tempted to say that all his creative work in a higher sense is homesickness too. Mahler was a Jew by race and deeply felt the spiritual need to be at home somewhere on this planet. Mahler's soul longed for a real home inside his own people, which for him was the German people. There is only one recording of Rickard's music made during his lifetime, the Kaddish, which is a Jewish prayer for the dead he composed for his father Gustav's death. It was recorded in a synagogue secretly in 1937 and sung at Rickard's cremation. Cremation is an anathema to most Jews, but Rickard's faith in God had long since vanished. He requested that there be no rabbi at his funeral. His final wish was for his ashes to be sprinkled over the bleak, brutal hills of the Rumatuckers. Rickard had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a theme running through his life like a Wagnerian leitmotif, a point made decades later by Timothy Jackson, a music professor in Texas.
Well, I just finished going through Fuchs's symphony. The work is, well, indeed masterfully scored. It ends with the C major blaze of light. This symphony is very Brucknerian, but not Bruckner. I'm afraid that in its highly Brucknerian tones, this symphony by Fuchs speaks the language of the perpetrator. If Fuchs had not been Jewish, then his aesthetic would have meshed perfectly with that of the Nazis. This is one of the supreme ironies of Fuchs's whole situation.
You know, he wrote the music possibly Nazis would have loved, which is kind of possibly true, but we'll never know because they never heard it. After Rickard's death, his daughter Eva took on the fight to get her father's music heard. She wrote a letter to Todd Duncan, a visiting American baritone.
And she said in the letter, when Richard died, I swore to myself to try and get his work recognised, if not in New Zealand, then by people outside New Zealand. I'm no judge of music. If it isn't worthwhile, let it rest in peace as its creator. And he did write.
Yeah, you know,
he
I've got
did
that letter
actually.
there.
You've got Todd. Well,
Yeah,
why don't
read
you?
that.
No, you
No,
read it.
read it.
Well, it's Todd Duncan. I
Yeah,
can't
well,
read
you put on a
everything.
bass American accent.
No, I
everything.
can't. Dear Mrs. Fuchs. I don't know why it was Mrs. Fuchs, because she was Miss. 26th of June 1949. Dear Miss Fuchs, your letter moved me greatly, and I hasten to tell you so. The manner in which you speak of your beloved father is touching and sincere. Bless you for it. At any rate, will you kindly come along to our suite? I invited her to his hotel on Wednesday, coming at 1:45. Please bring with you some of your father's music. Every good wish, yours, Todd Duncan.
Yeah, he sent her a photo of himself all written out.
He was lovely.
Yeah, you went to that concert.
Yes, I did.
Which song did he sing?
The one on the death of a child.
In September of 1958, Dora was in hospital and Eva had become very depressed. Mum got a telephone call from Dora and Eva's neighbours in the early hours of the morning.
She said, you'd better come over because the house is full of gas and there's fire brigade and police all over the place. Eva had a very tragic life. She went to and fro, looking up old boyfriends in Europe, and it didn't work. She'd finally had enough. She just had enough.
Again, life imitated art. After Eva's death, my mother had some private recordings done, but Rickard's music was eventually left in cartons in a dusty attic, only to be found many years later. Rickard Solomon Fuchs had many lives. The first Rickard, a proud German turned upon by his own country. The second Rickard, a refugee, an incongruous survivor washed up on the non-tropical deserted island of New Zealand. Today, Rickard Fuchs is being rediscovered. His music has been performed in Germany and New Zealand. The story of the third Rickard may just be beginning.
Ich hatte einst ein schönes Vaterland, der Eichenbaum wuchs dort so hoch, die Veilchen nickten sanft. Es war ein Traum, es war ein Traum. Das küsste mich auf Deutsch und sprach auf Deutsch. Man glaubt es kaum, wie gut es klang, das Wort, ich liebe dich. Es war ein Traum, es war ein Traum. Ich hatte einst ein schönes Vaterland, der Eichenbaum wuchs dort so hoch, die Veilchen nickten sanft. Es war ein Traum, es war ein Traum. Das küsste mich auf Deutsch und sprach auf Deutsch. Man glaubt es kaum, wie Gutes klang das Wort, ich liebe dich. Es war ein Traum, es war ein Traum.